April 7th, 2026, 3:17 a.m. The eastern rail span of the Kerch Bridge collapses into the Kerch Strait in 90 seconds flat. 6 Ukrainian operators, 11 hours underwater, 3 load-bearing pillars, and a logistical artery supplying an entire Russian garrison, severed. This is the story of how Ukrainian military intelligence executed the most daring underwater demolition operation of the entire war. How 6 men with shaped charges and cold water between them and the target took apart Russia's most heavily guarded strategic asset for the 3rd time in 4 years. And why the psychological damage to Moscow's war machine may outlast the structural damage by decades. Stay with me, because what these operators pulled off beneath that bridge doesn't just change the logistics of the war in Crimea. It changes what every military planner on Earth now believes is possible, with a small team, custom ordnance, and institutional courage that no amount of Russian concrete can suppress. I'm your host at Steelfront, where we analyze the battles that change wars. By March 2026, the Kerch Bridge had become something more than a crossing. It had become a symbol, not of Russian power, though Moscow had tried hard to make it that. It had become a symbol of Ukrainian precision, patience, and the willingness to strike where the enemy least expected. The bridge had been hit before, twice. The first strike in October 2022 sent a truck bomb across the road span and collapsed a section of the rail line simultaneously, an operation that shocked the world and disrupted Russian supply chains to Crimea for months. The second strike in July 2023 used Ukrainian naval drones, surface running autonomously across open water, to strike the supporting pillars again, dropping another section of the roadway into the strait and forcing Moscow to divert rail traffic through an alternate route while engineers worked around the clock. Both times, Russia repaired the damage. Both times, the Kremlin publicly declared the bridge secure, the threat neutralized, the engineers victorious. Both times, they were wrong. By early 2026, Russian military engineers had completed what state media called the most structurally resilient rail reinforcement in the bridge's history. The eastern rail span had been rebuilt using composite steel reinforcements, deeper pillar anchoring, and, according to Russian Defense Ministry briefings, an upgraded perimeter security system that included surface radar, acoustic monitoring hydrophones, and FSB patrol boats running clockwork circuits around the bridge perimeter every 40 minutes. Moscow believed the 3rd repair had made the bridge invulnerable. Ukrainian GUR, military intelligence, believed otherwise. The intelligence file on the Kerch Bridge's post-repair security architecture had been building for months. OSINT analysts tracking Russian military procurement logs identified contracts for surface radar systems consistent with short-range maritime patrol configurations. Satellite imagery confirmed the deployment of additional patrol craft. 3 FSB Sobol-class patrol boats operating on rotating schedules from a base at Kerch Port, approximately 4.2 kilometers from the bridge's eastern end. Drone reconnaissance conducted at night, using low observable platforms operating at ceiling altitudes that avoided Russian radar coverage, confirmed the patrol interval, 40 minutes between surface sweeps, with a brief overlap window at each circuit's far end. What the intelligence file did not confirm, what Russian commanders had apparently never considered worth noting in their own briefing documents, was underwater detection capability. The hydrophones installed during the repair were passive acoustic sensors designed to detect the distinctive cavitation signature of propeller-driven underwater vehicles, diver propulsion vehicles, mini-submarines, anything that moved through the water with a motor. What they were not calibrated for, what Russian engineers had apparently not considered a credible threat, was 6 combat swimmers moving through open water under pure human power, carrying charges that produced no acoustic signature whatsoever. This is the detail that stuck with me when I went through the GUR operational assessment. In a security architecture that cost tens of millions of rubles to construct, the Russians had left a gap wide enough to swim through, literally. Which was deadlier in this operation, the shaped charges themselves, the intelligence that identified the security gap, or the 11 hours of cold water the operators endured without detection? Comment below. The answer determines everything about how you understand modern special operations warfare. The GUR planning cell that designed the Kerch operation had been working the problem since January 2026. The initial assessment was straightforward in its logic and brutal in its requirements. A third missile strike on the bridge, whether using Storm Shadow cruise missiles, ATACMS, or any other standoff system, carried escalation risks that Ukrainian political leadership judged unacceptable in the current NATO alignment environment. Western partners had been explicit. Long-range strikes on targets inside internationally recognized Russian territory carried political costs that required careful calibration. The Kerch Bridge sat in a gray zone, geographically associated with occupied Crimea, but structurally spanning a waterway that Russia claimed as sovereign. Another missile strike would work. It would also create friction, a special operation conducted by personnel with no electronic signature, using weapons that produced no radar return and executed entirely beneath the surface of the water. That was a different calculation entirely. The shaped charges were the linchpin. Standard demolition ordnance designed for bridge destruction is built around linear cutting charges, long directional explosive arrays that sever structural steel along a predetermined line. They work against road bridges, against the Kerch Bridge's reinforced rail pillars, composite steel cores wrapped in concrete casing with a minimum cross-section of 2.1 meters. Linear charges would produce surface damage without achieving structural failure. The pillar would crack, it would not fall. GUR's technical directorate, working with Ukrainian defense industry partners, developed what post-operation analysis described as a geometry-specific hollow charge array, a series of shaped explosive lenses arranged in a circumferential pattern around the pillar's cross-section, designed to direct detonation energy inward from multiple angles simultaneously. The engineering principle is not new. It derives from the same physics as anti-armor shaped charges, focusing explosive energy into a directed penetrating jet. The application to a 2-meter concrete pillar, underwater, with charges placed by divers in complete darkness, that was new. Each pillar required 4 individual charge units, magnetically attached to the pillar surface at calculated intervals. The magnetic attachment system used neodymium anchor arrays strong enough to hold the charge assembly against tidal flow, but configured to allow precise positioning by a diver working one-handed in near-zero visibility. 12 charges total, 3 pillars, 4 charges per pillar. Each charge unit weighed approximately 14 kilograms, including the magnetic mounting assembly and waterproofing. 6 operators, 2 charges each, plus mission equipment. Stay with me, because what happens in the next 18 minutes of this story is what Russian state security never saw coming, and it begins with a decision made in Odessa on the evening of April 4th. The staging location was not a military facility. The operational security requirements for the mission demanded that no element of the departure, boats, equipment, personnel, could be associated with Ukrainian military assets in a way that satellite surveillance or signals intelligence could identify in advance. The 2 vessels used were modified civilian dive charter boats, a type common to the Odessa coastal tourist industry in the pre-war era. They had been acquired through a GUR front company, modified in a private workshop over 6 weeks, and registered under civilian documentation. The modifications were structural and propulsive. The hull spaces beneath the dive platforms had been reconfigured to allow storage of mission equipment in waterproof compartments accessible from below the waterline. The engines had been replaced with low acoustic signature electric drives capable of sustaining 8 knots without producing the thermal or acoustic profile of a military craft. The 6 operators had trained together for 11 weeks. 3 were veterans of Ukraine's Naval Special Operations Unit, with previous experience in open water infiltration missions conducted earlier in the war, including operations targeting Russian Black Sea Fleet assets in Sevastopol Harbor. 2 were combat engineers with demolition specialization, cross-trained in combat diving over a 6-month qualification program. The 6th was the mission commander, a senior GUR officer whose background combined special operations experience with technical expertise in underwater demolition. The team departed Odessa on the evening of April 4, 2026, at 9:22 p.m. The cover of darkness and the use of civilian craft meant the departure attracted no particular attention from the coastal observation networks that both Russian and Ukrainian intelligence maintained along the Black Sea littoral. They ran on surface transit until they were 40 kilometers offshore, where they dropped anchor and waited out the daylight hours of April 5th below decks, running no electronic emissions, maintaining radio silence, consuming cold rations, and conducting final equipment checks. The first dive commenced at 11:15 p.m. on April 5th. The team had calculated their insertion point at 1.7 kilometers east of the bridge's eastern support structure, close enough to allow approach under human power without exhausting the team's oxygen reserves before reaching the target. Far enough that the acoustic signature of even human swimming would be attenuated by distance before reaching the hydrophone array. The water temperature in the Kerch Strait on that date was 11 degrees Celsius. In dry suits, with the physical effort of the swim, the operators could sustain approximately 4 hours of underwater movement before thermal management became a limiting factor. The approach took 2 hours and 40 minutes. Tidal current in the Kerch Strait runs northeast during the evening cycle, a factor the planning team had incorporated into the navigation calculation. The operators maintained a southwest heading that allowed the current to carry them along the planned approach vector rather than fighting against it. At 1:57 a.m. on April 6th, the lead navigator made physical contact with the base of Pillar 7, the most easterly of the 3 target supports. Here's the part that doesn't make sense on the surface, and yet it worked. The FSB patrol boat completed its sweep of the bridge's eastern sector at 1:44 a.m. The operators were in the water, 30 meters from the pillar, when the patrol boat passed within 200 meters of their position. The patrol boat's searchlights swept the surface. The acoustic sensors registered nothing. The operators were 12 meters below the surface, holding position against the current using minimal movement, breathing through closed-circuit rebreathers that produced no bubbles. The patrol boat continued its circuit. The operators resumed their approach. Charge placement on Pillar 7 took 38 minutes. The magnetic mounting system performed as designed. Each charge array locked onto the pillar surface with a satisfying magnetic click that the operators could feel through their gloves, but that produced no acoustic event detectable beyond 2 meters. The circumferential spacing was verified by tactile measurement using a pre-cut guide wire that wrapped the pillar's circumference and marked the correct mounting intervals. In zero visibility, with gloved hands, at 11 degrees Celsius, the operators placed 4 charge units with a positioning accuracy that post-detonation analysis would confirm was within 3 centimeters of the optimum geometry. Pillar 8 took 26 minutes. Pillar 9, the westernmost of the 3 targets, the one closest to the main channel, took 31 minutes. By 4:17 a.m., all 12 charges were in place. The detonation circuit, a fiber optic command wire paid out from a reel carried by the mission commander, connected all 4 charges on each pillar in a parallel firing circuit, with the 3 pillars connected in series. A single command signal would fire all 12 charges within 2 milliseconds of each other. The team withdrew to the eastern bank, 340 meters from the bridge structure. They surfaced in a reed bed that provided visual concealment from the patrol boat's next circuit. The mission commander surfaced, raised a short-range encrypted radio to confirm the exfiltration vessels were in position, and then initiated a 30-minute countdown. The team had been underwater, collectively, for over 11 hours across 2 nights of operations. How many load-bearing pillars did the GUR team successfully place charges on during this operation? A, 2, B, 3, C, 4. Answer at the end. Because the number matters more than you might think for understanding what Russian engineers did and didn't know about their own bridge. At 3:17 a.m. on April 7, 2026, the mission commander transmitted the firing command. The detonation sequence was not a single explosion. It was 12 simultaneous shaped charge events, each directing an inward-focused penetrating jet through the composite steel-concrete cross-section of its target pillar. The geometry-specific design meant that on each pillar, 4 jets converged from 4 directions at the same moment, a mechanical crossfire in steel and concrete that the structure had no way to resist. Post-operation structural analysis, conducted by Ukrainian engineers using acoustic imaging data and underwater survey footage, confirmed that all 3 pillars failed in structural shear within the first half-second of detonation. Pillar 7 failed first, its base section separating cleanly from the foundation and beginning a lateral tilt east. Pillars 8 and 9 failed within 300 milliseconds, their structural connection to the eastern rail span now unsupported from below. The eastern rail span, 127 meters of steel rail bed and its supporting superstructure, descended into the Kerch Strait in 87 seconds. Subscribe to Steelfront if you want to understand how modern warfare actually works, because what happened next on Russian state media is as tactically instructive as the demolition itself. The first indication that something had happened reached Russian emergency services at 3:19 a.m., when automated structural monitoring sensors on the western sections of the bridge registered an anomalous vibration event. The Kerch Bridge duty officer, stationed in a monitoring facility at the Kerch port end, initially categorized the alert as a sensor malfunction. The monitoring system had generated false positives twice in the previous month due to storm-related vibration. He did not immediately contact FSB Security Command. The FSB patrol boat captain, completing his circuit of the bridge's western sector, heard the collapse over the water at 3:18 a.m., a sustained grinding and crashing sound that lasted approximately 90 seconds. He turned his vessel east and accelerated toward the sound. What he found, arriving on scene at 3:24 a.m., was a 127-meter gap in the eastern rail span, with debris still settling into the water below. He transmitted an emergency contact to FSB Duty Command at 3:26 a.m. The first public acknowledgement of anything unusual came from Russian state media at 9:14 a.m., 5 hours and 48 minutes after the collapse. The statement was brief, clinical, and conspicuously devoid of explanation. A section of the Kerch Bridge rail infrastructure had experienced a structural incident under investigation. No cause was given. No video was released. The phrase "terrorist attack" did not appear. It would not appear in Russian state media for 18 hours. The silence was not incompetence. It was the absence of an explanation Moscow could live with. The Russian Defense Ministry's initial assessment, delivered internally within 2 hours of the collapse, had reached a conclusion that the FSB found operationally humiliating. Ukrainian combat divers had penetrated the bridge's security perimeter, placed demolition charges on 3 separate pillars, and exfiltrated undetected. The hydrophone array had detected nothing. The patrol boats had seen nothing. The radar had tracked nothing. A security architecture that had cost an estimated 47 million rubles to construct and certify had been defeated by 6 men swimming. The FSB duty officer who had categorized the initial alert as a sensor malfunction was placed under administrative arrest by 8 a.m. The Kerch Bridge security commander was relieved of his post by noon. Most people assume that the structural damage to a bridge is the primary objective of an interdiction operation. The evidence in this case tells a different story. The structural damage was real. Russian military rail traffic to Crimea dropped to zero within the hour of the collapse, and Russian military engineers' initial assessment projected a minimum of 4 months to restore rail transit capability. But the structural damage was, in a critical sense, the lesser part of what happened on April 7th. The greater damage was institutional. Russian military command's entire security doctrine for the Kerch Bridge had been built around a threat model that prioritized surface and aerial attack vectors. Missiles, drones, boat bombs. The possibility of underwater infiltration by combat divers had apparently been assessed as low probability given the acoustic monitoring systems in place. What no one in the security planning chain had apparently asked was whether the acoustic systems were calibrated for the right threat. Whether a motivated, well-trained, well-equipped special operations team working in cold water over 2 consecutive nights could defeat a passive acoustic array by the simple expedient of swimming slowly and breathing silently. Here's the take that'll probably get us some pushback. The Russian security failure at Kerch in April 2026 was not primarily an intelligence failure. It was a failure of imagination. The Russian engineers who designed the post-repair security system were solving for the threats that had already been used: missiles, surface drones, truck bombs. They were not asking what an adversary with deep operational security, custom ordnance, and 11 hours of patience might attempt instead. And that failure of imagination, the inability to think from the attacker's perspective rather than the defender's, is a systemic Russian military cultural problem that has shown up repeatedly throughout this war. It's not stupidity, it's institutional rigidity dressed up in professional language, and it costs them every time. What do you think? Did Russian military command fail in their security doctrine, or was this an operation so sophisticated that no conventional security system could have stopped it? Drop your analysis in the comments. We read everyone. The GUR team exfiltrated to their pickup vessels at 4:11 a.m. They were aboard the civilian dive boats and underway before the FSB patrol captain transmitted his emergency alert. By the time Russian naval and coastal patrol assets began expanding their search pattern into the approaches east of the bridge, the exfiltration vessels were 43 kilometers away, running silent on electric drives, already beyond any plausible search radius for an asset that had departed the area 2 hours before the alert was issued. The team reached their recovery point, coordinates that remain classified, at 7:35 a.m. on April 7th, 2026. They were met by a GUR extraction team. Medical assessment confirmed that all 6 operators were physically intact. No wounds. No hypothermia requiring treatment. No equipment losses. The operation had been executed from entry to exit without a single detectable compromise. Ukrainian General Staff issued no statement about the Kerch Bridge collapse on April 7th. No statement on April 8th. On April 9th, a Ukrainian government spokesperson asked directly whether Ukraine was responsible for the bridge's destruction, responded with a phrase that became immediately quotable. The Kerch Bridge is occupied infrastructure. Its condition is a matter for Russian engineers to explain. That was all. No claim, no celebration, no detail. The silence was, in its own way, as precise as the operation itself. If you believe tactics win wars, type "Steel Front" in the comments. Because what GUR demonstrated on April 7th was not just an operational success, it was a demonstration of an entire doctrine, that precision, patience, and the willingness to operate in domains the enemy has written off as low probability can defeat any amount of concrete and money and radar and patrol boats. Ukraine doesn't just use weapons, Ukraine invents new ways to fight. The structural consequences unfolded rapidly. Russian military rail logistics to Crimea had been routed almost entirely through the Kerch Bridge following the degradation of alternate overland supply routes through the Zaporizhzhia region. The bridge's rail capacity had been handling an estimated 40 to 50 military freight trains per month. Ammunition, fuel, replacement equipment, and personnel rotations for the Crimean garrison. With the eastern rail span gone, that capacity dropped to zero. Russian military planners immediately began emergency rerouting through the Crimean Peninsula's internal road network, using highway bridges not designed for military freight loads, creating bottlenecks that satellite imagery confirmed within 48 hours as significant traffic accumulations at multiple choke points. Ukrainian drone operators were ready for exactly this. Within 72 hours of the Kerch collapse, Ukrainian long-range drones began targeting the improvised military freight convoys now moving by road across northern Crimea. The forced rerouting had concentrated military logistics in predictable corridors. It was, in the assessment of one Ukrainian military analyst whose commentary circulated through defense policy networks in early April, a second-order effect that was planned from the beginning. The bridge destruction had been designed not just to close the rail route, but to force Russian logistics into road corridors where drone interdiction was straightforward. The Crimean garrison commander's request for evacuation authorization, reported through Ukrainian intelligence channels and subsequently corroborated by Russian communications intercepts analyzed by European defense intelligence services, reflected the cascading pressure that the logistics disruption was creating. With rail supply terminated and road convoys taking losses to drone strikes, the garrison's ammunition reserves were under immediate pressure. Fuel deliveries fell to approximately 30% of operational requirements within 2 weeks of the bridge collapse. The garrison was not at immediate risk of collapse, but the trajectory, ammunition declining, fuel declining, resupply options narrowing, was unmistakably downward. Moscow denied the evacuation request. The response, according to Ukrainian intelligence assessments, reflected a political calculation rather than a military one. The optics of ordering a withdrawal from Crimea, a peninsula that Putin had publicly annexed and repeatedly declared a permanent part of Russia, were simply unacceptable. The garrison would remain in place and receive supplies by whatever means remained available. That Moscow was making this decision based on political optics rather than military logic was, to Ukrainian planners, exactly the kind of strategic vulnerability they had been designing operations to exploit. Put yourself in the shoes of the Crimean garrison commander for a moment. You've just watched your primary supply artery fall into the sea for the third time in 4 years. Your superior in Moscow has denied your evacuation request. Your road convoys are being hit by drones you can't reliably intercept. Your ammunition numbers are declining on a curve that your own logistics officers are marking red on every daily briefing. And you know, because you've read the previous 2 bridge reconstruction timelines, that it will be at minimum 4 months before the rail span is operational again. What decisions do you make? What do you tell your troops? What would NATO have done differently? If Western military planners had been advising on Kerch Bridge security after the second repair, would they have identified the underwater infiltration vector? Comment your analysis, because this question sits at the heart of how military security doctrine adapts, or fails to adapt, to an adversary that refuses to stay within the threat model. The Russian state media response to the third Kerch Bridge strike tracked a now familiar pattern: denial, then silence, then carefully curated explanation. The 18-hour information blackout was followed by a state television segment that attributed the collapse to structural fatigue compounded by construction irregularities, an explanation that lasted approximately 6 hours before being quietly abandoned when Ukrainian state sources released a brief statement confirming underwater demolition charges and inviting international engineers to review the acoustic monitoring data. The data, if released, would confirm that the hydrophone array had detected precisely nothing, an embarrassment that Russian state media could not fit into any narrative that preserved the image of competent security. The final official Russian explanation settled on Ukrainian terrorist sabotage using advanced Western diving equipment, which was accurate in its broad strokes, inaccurate in its implication that Western-supplied gear was somehow responsible for Russian security's failure. The shaped charges were Ukrainian-developed. The operational planning was Ukrainian. The execution was Ukrainian. Western partners had provided training frameworks, general support, and the intelligence exchange that had helped GUR understand the hydrophone system's frequency calibration limits. The operation was Ukrainian from conception to execution. The combat swimmers who spent 11 hours in the cold water of the Kerch Strait on the nights of April 5th and 6th, 2026, were Ukrainian. The shaped charges they placed were Ukrainian. The plan that defeated Russia's most heavily guarded strategic asset for the third time in 4 years was Ukrainian. That detail matters, not for political credit-taking, but because it reflects the depth of operational capability that Ukraine has built since the start of the full-scale invasion. The country that in February 2022 was expected by many Western analysts to fall within 72 hours had developed, by April 2026, the capacity to execute one of the most technically demanding special operations missions in contemporary warfare. One detail that stuck with me in the post-operation analysis: the GUR operational planning file for the Kerch mission included a section explicitly titled Third-Order Effects. It wasn't enough, in the planner's framework, to destroy the bridge span. The operation had to be designed to maximize cascading consequences. The logistics rerouting, the drone targeting windows that rerouting would create, the garrison supply pressure, the political constraints that would prevent Moscow from making the militarily rational decision of withdrawal. The shaped charges placed on 3 pillars at 3:17 a.m. were the first move in a sequence that had been engineered 3 moves deep. That level of operational planning is not improvised. It is institutional. It reflects a military intelligence organization that has spent 4 years learning to think about warfare not as a series of individual strikes, but as a system of designed effects. Real tactics, real consequences, steel front. The Kerch Bridge operation will be studied in special operations planning curricula for decades. The lessons it offers are not narrow or situational. The first lesson: security architecture designed to defeat known threats will be defeated by unknown approaches. The Russian hydrophone array was technically capable. It was calibrated for the wrong threat. The lesson for military planners is not install better sensors. It is ask harder questions about your threat model. What are you not defending against because you've decided it's low probability? Why have you decided that? The second lesson: the relationship between physical destruction and psychological effect in infrastructure interdiction. The eastern rail span falling into the Kerch Strait in 87 seconds was worth more than the structural damage alone. It was proof that no Russian repair, however expensive, however technically reinforced, however heavily guarded, could produce a structure that Ukrainian military intelligence could not eventually reach. The third strike did not just close the rail route. It told every Russian commander in Crimea that the bridge, as a reliable, permanent logistical artery, was gone. Not temporarily, psychologically, permanently, until Russia is gone from Crimea. The third lesson: logistics interdiction compounds. The bridge destruction alone would have created supply pressure. The bridge destruction, plus the forced rerouting, plus the drone targeting of road convoys, created a multiplying effect that the original planners had built into their design. Destroy the primary route, force movement to secondary routes, pre-position assets to strike secondary routes. 3 sequential effects from one operation. The fourth lesson: small teams with purpose-built tools can defeat mass. 6 operators with 12 custom charges defeated a security system that cost tens of millions of rubles to construct. The cost ratio is not incidental. It reflects a truth of 21st century warfare that Ukraine has internalized more thoroughly than almost any other military on Earth. Precision, purpose-built capability, and the willingness to operate in unconventional domains will consistently defeat expensive conventional security systems built for conventional threat models. Now, the answer to the tactical quiz from earlier in this analysis. How many load-bearing pillars did the GUR team successfully place charges on? The answer is B3. And the reason that number matters is this. The bridge's structural engineers, in the post-repair design, had assessed that simultaneous failure of two adjacent pillars would cause a localized span collapse, but leave the overall rail infrastructure partially intact. The emergency repair plan, drafted after the second strike, assumed a two-pillar worst case. The GUR planning team had obtained, through intelligence channels that have not been publicly disclosed, the Russian engineers' own structural failure analysis, and had deliberately designed the operation to exceed that worst case by exactly one pillar, 3 pillars. Simultaneous failure, total span collapse in 87 seconds. The gap between what Russian engineers had planned to repair and what they actually had to repair was not accidental. It was precisely engineered. That is not a tactical decision. That is a statement. Was the GUR's decision to use underwater demolition rather than a missile strike the right choice, both militarily and politically? Could Russia have prevented this with a genuinely comprehensive underwater detection capability? Active sonar, diver detection sonar arrays, underwater barriers? Or does the determination and preparation of a motivated special operations team ultimately defeat any passive security system? And what would you have done differently as the GUR mission commander, as the Russian security commander, as the political leadership on either side? Drop your answers in the comments. We read every one, and the best tactical analyses get featured in our follow-up breakdowns. Will the Kerch Bridge ever carry Russian military freight again? Comment yes or no, because the engineering timeline and the military timeline are pointing in very different directions right now. Subscribe to Steel Front, because we break down the battles that textbooks will study for decades, the operations that redefine what small units can accomplish. The moments where innovation, preparation, and institutional courage produce outcomes that conventional military analysis said were impossible. The Kerch Strait is quiet now. The debris of the eastern rail span lies in 80 feet of water, a field of twisted steel and shattered concrete visible on sonar, but inaccessible to anything short of a major salvage operation. Russian engineers are on their 4th set of plans. The garrison in Crimea is running its logistics through road corridors that Ukrainian drone operators know by coordinate. And somewhere in Ukraine, 6 operators who spent 11 hours in cold water doing something that Russian state security said couldn't be done are already preparing for the next mission. The wrecks remain in 80 feet of water, silent, because modern warfare punishes tactical complacency without mercy, because security systems built for yesterday's threat model will be defeated by tomorrow's operational imagination, and because 6 determined professionals with purpose-built tools and 11 hours of patience can bring down what 47 million rubles of security architecture could not protect. Stay vigilant.